Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this morning's Japan Society seminar to celebrate the launch of the August edition of Wasafiri magazine, which you can't see properly because of my screen background. We're delighted to welcome a very stellar panel who are led by Elizabeth Chappell, and she will introduce them later as we go on. My job is to welcome you all. My name's Heidi Potter and I work for the Japan Society, and to give you some housekeeping. The event will probably last about 1 hour and 15 minutes in order to allow time for audience questions at the end. You can give your questions using the Zoom question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any technical issues or get locked out, you can put those in the chat or email the Japan Society. I'll ask my colleague to put the Japan Society email address in the chat function so that you can see that, and we will try and sort you out. But in the meantime, I hope you have enjoy the session. It's going to be fascinating. I'm going to disappear and leave the floor to the stars of the show today. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello and welcome to our launch event for Wasafiri 102. This is a journal that is published here in the UK. I'm trying to show it up on the screen, but you can also find a link, I think, in the chat. Wasafiri was, it's worth introducing the magazine first of all. It was first published here in the UK in 1984, and it comes out of a number of writers and intellectuals from diverse backgrounds here in the UK who were struggling to get attention in the mainstream press. And they pioneered reviewing novels and poetry of writers who were at the time hardly known, but are now very well known, and that the magazine specifically sought to challenge the assumption of work that would be of so-called minority interest. And the magazine has remained wedded to an unbounded vision of writing across worlds with which it began. And it pioneers a shift in literary, cultural and critical scenes with a whole mix of fiction, poetry, interviews, essays and reviews, seeking to create a dialogue between different cultures and provide a space for the publication of distinctive new work from across the globe. And that's where Wasafiri 102 comes in. We were very lucky that Wasafiri offered us an interest in Japan at this moment, 75 years after the end of the Pacific War, and also coinciding with the UK-Japan season of culture. So we've been very lucky to be supported by the UK-Japan season of culture, and also the Great British Sasakawa Foundation, who enabled us to translate many new writers to the UK, writers who are not known in the English language particularly well, and to show the diversity of writing, some of the diversity of writing that is available from the Japanese cultural scene at the moment. So I'm very, very honoured today to be joined by some of the key contributors to the issue, who are going to present some of their work and also some of their thinking. First of all, we're very happy to be joined by the poet Mimi Hachikai, who will be reading us her poem, which is in the issue. And she will be introduced by her translator, Yoshida Kyoko, who is a writer of fiction in the English language. She also translates many major US novelists, including people like David Foster Wallace, into Japanese. And she translates contemporary Japanese poetry and drama into English, and as well as American novels into Japanese. So I'm going to leave Kyoko to introduce Hachikai Mimi, but I will also introduce the other speakers right now. So we're joined by Stephen Dodd, who is Emeritus Professor of Japanese from the School of Oriental and African Studies. He's also published many titles, critical titles, with new translations of his own, including Writing Home, Representations of Native Place, and The Youth of Things, Life and Death in the Age of Kaiji Motojiro. So he is joining us to talk this time mainly about his work on early modernist fiction, and we are also joined. Very, very happy to say that we're joined by Rayna Denison. So Rayna is a senior lecturer at the University of East Anglia, and she is an expert on manga and anime. She's the author of Anime, A Critical Introduction, and she's also the editor of Princess Mononoke, Understanding Studio Ghibli's Monster Princess, was published in 2018. And she's currently writing an industrial history of Studio Ghibli. So I'm very, very happy to be able to welcome you all. And as we said, we are going to first of all go straight to Yoshida Kyoko and Hachikai Mimi, who will be reading her poem in Japanese and English. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to introduce Mimi Hachikai. Mimi Hachikai is a prominent voice of contemporary Japanese poetry. She is also a prolific writer of fiction, children's stories, essays, criticism, and reviews. She is also a translator of children's stories and Japanese classics. She teaches creative writing at Rikkyo University in Tokyo. Since her debut with the collection Ima ni mo uruotte iku jinchi, which was translated into English as The Quickening Field by Juliet Winters Carpenter, Mimi Hachikai has won numerous awards, including Nakahara Chuya Prize, the Minister of Education, Culture and Sciences Award for New Artists, and Ayukawa Nobuo Prize. Reading her poetry invites you to excavate the memories stored in each one of us, the memories of the times before we were born, the memories of the humankind from the prehistoric era to the memories of our ancestors in the modern conflicts and catastrophes, and even the memories of animals and plants and trees and minerals. Her poetry also heightens our awareness that our bodies are the vessels of the future memories. Her distinctive pen name, Mimi, which means ear in Japanese, and Hachikai, which means beekeeper, would stick with you once you read her unique poems and prose. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mimi Hachikai, and we'll read the poem published in Wasafiri today.
Thank you, Yoshida-san. Hello, everyone. I read my poem in Japanese. 骨拾い。志願の理由を70年も経っては語れないのだ。特攻隊志願の理由は何十年も経つと本人にさえわからぬうちにそっと足場を移している。そのことに気づいた暗がりの穴を親子それぞれの懐中電灯で照らしてみても始まらない。50の時生まれた子は、はげた男の引きずる死の影から養分を吸い上げて育ち、今ではよるべない文字などを書き綴るばかり。このまま走り切ってしまいたい手持ちのカレンダー。ある日、引き出された台車の上、熱の残る父の骨は ももの骨ばかり頑丈なのがおかしい。横たわったままいまだに踏ん張っているのか。入りきらない。係の人がしびれを切らして、壺の蓋を上からぐーっと押す。すると骨は騒ぐのだ。慌てて係の人が説明の声を大きくする。パリパリというその騒ぎをかき消しているのだ。骨は黙る。やがて冷えていく地平線。遠くに立ち並ぶ者たちが見える。みんなポカーンとしている。眠るようにこの世の熱気は退いて、顔の奥からまた顔が来る。ポカーンとしている。
Bone picking. The reasons why you volunteered cannot be put in words after 70 years. The reasons why you volunteered for Special Attack Corps shift their footing quietly over decades before you notice. We realize it in a dark hall. It's no use trying to shine a light into it. Father and daughter, each with a torch in hand. The child born at 50 grew up, sucking sustenance from the shadow of death this bold man dragged, and now keeps scribbling forlorn letters. Let's rush through the remaining calendars like this. One day, on a gurney that is being pulled out, father's bones still retain heat. How funny, only thigh bones remain sturdy. Perhaps he's still bracing hard, lying horizontal. They don't fit. The urn, it's lead. The impatient clerk squeezes hard, and the bones clamor. The anxious clerk raises his explanatory tones, deafening us to the clamor as he shuts up the bones. Soon the horizon will cool and reveal those lining up in the distance. Everybody open-mouthed. The heat of this world recedes like a sleep, for a face to emerge out of the depth of another face, open-mouthed.
Thank you so much.
So now I'm gonna ask a couple of questions to Hachikai-san, and
Yes.
How much time do we have left? Like,
I think you have at least about 5 minutes.
okay, good. My first question is that this poem, Bone Picking, is collected in her latest collection, Kao Arau Mizu, Some Water to Wash My Face. And along with another poem titled One Death, the poems deal with her father's death. And both of them, unlike other poems collected in the collection, that they were never published in journals before. So I find them very personal. But at the same time, her father's memory is connected with his experience at World War II. I first would like to ask the inspiration behind this poem and the relationship between the personal memories and the history in Hachikai-san's poetry. 骨拾いは詩集顔洗う水書集で、ある詩とともに父親の詩を扱っているんですけれども、どちらも書き下ろし で、とりわけ詩集の中で個人的な作品だと感じます。ね、このお父さんの思い出という個人的な経験が父親が生き延びた第二次世界大戦という歴史の出来事とどうつながっているのか。この詩のインスピレーション、個人と歴史の関係などが八海さんの詩の中でどのようにつながっているのか教えてください。
はい、吉田さんありがとうございます。個人と歴史の関係ということなんですが、個人の人生は、歴史的な出来事の流れの中にある意味で飲み込まれているところがあると思います。
That personal histories is kind of swallowed up in the how do you say that the bigger more national international histories. That's how she feels.
それは時間が経って振り返ったときに初めてわかるものでもあると思います。
But at the same time, that's something you realize only later when you look it back.
で、その、いろんな出来事の悲しみも喜びもあると思うんですけれども、個人がどのような時代に、生を受けたかということを、詩の中にもどこかしらで、取り込んで書きたいと感じます。
So there are joys and sorrows of each person in different times of history, and I would like to kind of incorporate those different periods, different times in my poetry.
個人の力は、小さいものであるとも言えるし、時には、大きな力ともなると思います。
The power each individual has. Sometimes it is not strong, but sometimes it has some power.
詩の言葉はそういう、微妙な点を切り取ることができると信じています。
I believe the poetic language is capable of highlighting the power the language has.
Okay.
Okay, my second question. I would like to ask about humor because this Kotsuhiroi is about her father's death, but at the same time, it has this humor in it.
Yes. Sure.
ユーモアについて、はい、お願いします。
どうだろう。何かこう、詩などの真面目なというか、ある意味人間にとって深刻な事態を見つめるときに、それが裏返って、ユーモアが生まれる時があると思うんですよね。コツヒロに関しては自然にそうなりました。
In like really grave moment in life, sometimes it kind of flips and the humor surfaces. But in case of Kotsuhiroi, bone picking, it came very naturally. この詩は個人的な体験っていうものに根付いていると思うんですけれども、他に何か文学的な影響みたいなのはありますか？
私もともと日本の古代の神話を学生時代は勉強していて、その個人の名前がつく以前の大勢の人たちが受け継いできた話とか、説話、伝説とか、そういったものに関心がありますね。
She's interested in ancient literature, so fables and stories and myth before people became individuals. どうもありがとうございます。Thank you
Thank
very
you so much. Thank you. ありがとうございます。
Thank you so much, Mimi, and thank you, Mimi-san, and thank you so much, Yoshida Kyoko-san. Thank you. That was so moving. I always found that poem really, really deep and interesting, and it works so well with our next speaker now because Rayna is obviously particularly interested and writes in the issue about adaptations from myth and from European myth and from other mythical traditions through the lens of manga and anime artists. And she, particularly in the issue, she focuses on the work of Studio Ghibli, but of course Studio Ghibli arose, didn't it, out of a whole movement of manga originally. And so perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about how Ghibli in a way adapted many manga artists and writers and sort of, you know, turned them into great successes. Perhaps could you start from there, Rayna?
I think after hearing Hachiko Sensei's wonderful poem and Yoshida Sensei's wonderful translation, if it's all right, I might
go ahead.
And I might start by thinking about what women authors mean to manga, because that is, I think, of all of the popular media in Japan, women have had a huge influence on manga, maybe more than any other medium. Women are there as authors and artists in a way that's been present since basically since the 1960s, since the post-war era. And I think if we go back into that history, we can see now such a diversity of voices and ideas and thoughts and memories about Japan and about how Japan's media industries work together as well. So if you don't mind, I'll start there very briefly and do a potted history of women in manga. So the first big movement for women into manga authorship and artistry starts with the Year 24 group, which is sometimes also translated as the Fabulous 49ers to refer to the fact that they were all born around 1949. With these women came a proliferation of new genres and new concepts that were specific to women. And I think that's embodied really nicely by an author-artist like Hagi Omoto, whose work even early on started people thinking about sensuality and sexuality in women's genres. And she is now credited with having started what's known as the BL or boys' love genre, because she did teen romances that looked to romances between boys at school. From there, I think we start to see the growth of female star authors in manga in Japan. And it's these big stars that give us the first connections between manga and anime. People like Rumiko Takahashi, whose work in Ranma Half and Urusei Yatsura helped to popularize sort of gender comedy and also popularize the shoujo genre as well. This only strengthens over time with people like Chiho Saito and the Bee Papas, who did this wonderful book, Revolutionary Girl Utena, which builds on other traditions, both queer and shoujo related, to create a genre of beautiful fighting girls that has become hugely popular and well known within shoujo or girls manga ever since. Along with people like that, you have Naoko Takeuchi doing Sailor Moon, and I think that's where we start to see the solidification of the warrior girls and the magical girls of shoujo. But from there in the 1990s, things exploded again, and now we have every manner of women and girl-oriented genre, from autobiography by manga artists to things like women's manga that look at child rearing and stories around the home and the family as well. So it's not all fantastical fighting girls. There's a huge range there. One of my favorite autobiographies is this one, which I don't know if people can see. This is Insufficient Direction by Moyoko Anno, who's married to Hideaki Anno, the creator of Neon Genesis Evangelion, the anime and movie series. And it's about their life together. And what I love about this book is it's a trip through her memory of manga. So it's drawn in previous artists' differing styles of manga. And it's also about the history of anime and the history of manga as told through her relationship with her husband. And that brings us nicely to the way Studio Ghibli plays with these ideas of manga, history, and memory. Many people will know that one of Hayao Miyazaki's very first movies was Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which was based on this book, his own manga by the same name. That was actually before Studio Ghibli was formed, but as you can tell from this and Miyazaki's other early film, Lupin Sensei Castle of Cagliostro, there's a big influence of manga into anime, into films that influences Studio Ghibli and of course Hayao Miyazaki along the way. What I think is remarkable about Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli is quite how many of their films are actually adaptations. We often think of Miyazaki's movies as gansaku, or original works, but actually he borrows from folklore, from fantasy, and from international and Japanese literary and manga traditions. So in the Wasafiri article I wrote, I talked about how he's adapted famous European authors, particularly someone like Diana Wynne Jones, whose book he uses as the source for Howl's Moving Castle. But also he did adaptation work for his son's film, Tales from Earthsea, which is by Ursula Le Guin as well. So we get him doing adaptation work even when he's not the director of the film. And that includes manga as well. So Chizuru Takahashi, who's the female artist from Up on Poppy Hill, her work was adapted by Hayao Miyazaki into Goro Miyazaki's film of the same name. But Japanese literature plays a huge important role in Ghibli's films as well. Eiko Kadano's famous Kiki's Delivery Service was adapted into a 1980s film by Hayao Miyazaki. And she is a hugely important female author in her own right, having just won the Hans Christian Andersen Award for Children's Literature. And I think that brings me to think about who else in Studio Ghibli might be adapting manga particularly well. And for me, the best adapter of manga, particularly women's manga, is actually Isaw Takahata. So people probably know that his film, My Neighbors the Yamadas, was based on a manga. But his film Only Yesterday, Omoide Poroporo, was also adapted from a manga by Hotara Okamoto and Yuko Tone. And for me, that film is just the epitome of everything we're talking about today. It's about memory. It's about visions of memory. And it's about adapting from one person's memory into an animated film. So what I love about this movie is Omoide Poroporo is that it has this beautiful social realist aesthetic to the animation, except when it flashes back to childhood memory, and then it becomes abstract and bathed in beautiful light and filled with the kind of joyous recollections of childhood, all of which are taken pretty much directly from the original manga. So there's a way in which Takahata actually, I think, even more than Miyazaki, brings manga to life, brings those kind of narratives and traditions of memory and storytelling, and particularly women's storytelling, to life in this movie, Only Yesterday. So that's just a very brief overview. If anybody has any questions, I would love to take them. I'd love to talk more about any of this.
Would you just briefly, because we have a little bit more time, just very briefly, I have one question, which
Sure.
is, could you talk a little bit more about from Up on Poppy Hill, because I think that in terms of, obviously it's more Miyazaki's and Takahata's, it's his son Goro directed it, but he worked with a female manga and writer as well. So. And it was particularly interesting, partly because of its timing, in terms of this theme of memory.
Yes.
Yeah, so perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
So in terms of the adaptation process, I think that it's really interesting. This From Up on Poppy Hill comes after one of Hayao Miyazaki's retirements. So after one of those times when he was definitely never ever coming back to do any more work, and then he comes back to do more work. and he works, I think in his latter years, he's done this more and more, working with female partners to produce screenplays and to produce works. This is a particularly interesting one because it was meant to be a big cinematic release, and it was being made and finished just as the 3/11 disaster happened in Japan, the Great Eastern Kanto earthquake. And because of that timing, what they ended up doing, I think, was meaningful to the people of Japan, because they took the film to Fukushima and surrounding areas, to schools, and showed it in schools, even when cinemas were shut, even when they couldn't release it any other way. They would show it in school halls to children as a way of, you know, remembering positive things and giving students positive things to look forward to in that very difficult moment.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really moving example. So I'm sorry to cut you a little bit short, Rayna, but we are going to come back and discuss in more detail. So when we have questions come through, we can address them. But first of all, I would like to move to Stephen Dodd, who writes a wonderful review article in our magazine, and he specifically talks about where his interests in Japanese literature began. And I think that this whole idea of personal memory that we just touched on in anime and also in the poetry, I think fits very well with what Stephen wants to talk about, which is this idea of home and furusato, and how that is so important for some of the early, especially the sort of pre-war. We talk a lot. We just talked about post-war. Talk about pre-war Japanese writers who, of course, were dealing with like one of the biggest upheavals in Japanese society at the time. So perhaps we could start, Stephen, by talking about what you see in this theme of furusato, which of course is a literary term, isn't it? It's not necessarily what we'd talk about as going home. It's not like there are so many Japanese words for home, aren't there? And it's very different from that. It evokes, it's much more evocative. So I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say on that.
Thank you for that. Well, I think as you get older, you begin to become more reflective. That is, you begin to look back. And so if I can, I have this interest in memory, and time, the past and the present. How does that link up? And talking about looking back, one thing that when I was thinking about this morning, to warm me up, I thought of that. There's this fantastic image by Walter Benjamin, a very famous critic, who talks about the angel of history. And for him, he describes the angel, well, he's talking about a particular painting, a Paul Klee painting. But in any case, the angel of history has a kind of mad look on his face, and he's falling backwards into the future. And what he's looking at with horror and with like disbelief is all the paraphernalia of what's come before. And it's almost, it's like you're pulling the tablecloth of the whole universe with you, and everything's gone crazy. So for me, that's a fantastic image, because it completely overthrows the idea of some simple narrative that we're going from point A to point B in the future and so on. And this hopefully links up my general interest in the concept of the furusato. And you have, as part of my reflective stage, you have to ask yourself, why on earth do you choose particular subjects? What gets you there in the first place? And for me, it is the idea of belonging. Where do we belong? Where do we, or where, well, more personally, where do I come from? And so actually, the first really influential book for me was not a Japanese critic, but a British critic, Raymond Williams, a very influential, very productive Marxist critic in the post-war period, who wrote this very famous book, The Country and the City, where he talks about, he noticed how in English literature, people talk about this idyllic country retreat or country place, and then he begins to realize that everyone's always saying how it was better before, and then when you trace back through Western culture, you end up with the early Greek writers who talk about how it was so much better in the olden days. In other words, there is no end, there is no point of perfection. It's always a point of looking back. And so this led me to look generally at I suppose it's sort of late Meiji, Meiji Taisho literature. So basically from about 1890 to 1930, or going up to the war period, shall we say. And I noticed in particular that there's this style of writing which has been described in Japanese, furusato bungaku, the literature of the native place, where you have usually men, and it is gendered, I think it's very gendered here, it's usually young male writers, they describe, who now live in Tokyo, they go back to where they came from. And always when they go back, the sky is bluer, the water's fresher, the girls are pretty, the mothers are loving and always giving. I mean, it's a complete total male fantasy, really. But of course, it's not really. I mean, but this shall we say, the challenge to whether we're talking about a real, going back to the past or not, I think that becomes an open question, because what's really going on, I think, is the person is talking about their dissatisfaction with where they are here and now. In fact, although I wrote this book about the Furusato, actually, I have no interest in the real place. I mean, I go to places, they're very pretty. I don't hate real places. But when it comes to the concept of the Furusato, it's not really about the real place. And there was one particular short story that I remember vividly when I was doing my research, was by Kunikira Doppo, who is an experimental writer in the sort of late 1890s, around that time. And he wrote this story, which is not well known, I think, called Kikyodai, like Let Me Return. And a very important Japanese critic, Maeda Ai, he said, this is the first example of real Furusato literature. And what you have in that story is precisely that. A young man goes back to Tokyo, goes back from Tokyo to where he came from, and he's looking for a pure bride, right? So, and of course, it's also the place where his mother lived, and also where his grandmother lived. And when he goes to see his grandmother, he goes back up a river, up a valley to the home of the mother. So it's very much almost like going back, to the womb. It's as straightforwardly sketched out as that. But what really interested me when I read it was I noticed that the hero, or the main character, there's a point where he goes to the top of a very beautiful hill, and he looks over the countryside and he says, I'm home. I'm back to where I belong. But when he gets to the top of the hill, he's reading a book. And the book is a book called Rasselas by Samuel Johnson. And Rasselas is the story about someone who leaves home, and then it's only when they come back home they realize they didn't have to leave in the first place. In other words, shall we say, the truth was here all the time. But the interesting point to me was that this, shall we say, this archetypal landscape of Japan is being read and interpreted and rediscovered through a Western text. And so that, for me, that excited me, because it's the messiness of things. It's not possible to talk about going back home and so on. And so that was my interest. And then I think there are, it's a useful way of looking at literature. It's not the only way of looking at Japanese literature, but for instance, talking about memory, where does memory come from? Just almost off the top of my head, one of my favorite ever stories is by Tanizaki Junichiro. It's called The Bridge of Dreams, Yume no Ukihashi. And it's if you look in, there's this great book of translated book by Howard Hibbett, 7 Japanese Tales. And the story, The Bridge of Dreams, is about a man who is losing his mind. He's old, he's losing his mind. And it's a blend of where he came from and where he is now. And he doesn't know quite who he is. And you might think, oh, that sounds terrible. It's about, the Alzheimer's or or dementia, and he's lost it. But it's so beautifully done, and it's in other words, it's a kind of ambiguous space that he is sketching out. And I think that a lot of people, when it comes to the role of literature, but particularly I think poetic, as we heard with Hachikai-san's poem, but in poetic language, it has the ability, precisely because it has a certain ambiguity, it allows us to inhabit different spaces at the same time, and then come out of it thinking, have I got it or haven't I got it? And when I was younger, that used to really annoy me, because I was trying to get the answer. But now, perhaps because I'm beginning to lose my own mind a little bit, I'm beginning to think, actually, there's something very beautiful about that, about like being lost, and sort of the King Learish, well, hopefully not as tragic as King Lear, but the sort of slight King Learish side of things. I mean, there's lots more I could say, but maybe I should stop there.
Well, I think that, just to sort of extend that, is that seems to be, it's that ambiguity of feeling, really, a search of a self, in search of the self, that you come across again and again in those early modernist writers from Japan, and this sense of this split. Sometimes it's literally, Tanizaki writes the story about Tomoda and Matsunaga, about the literally kind of Jekyll and Hyde kind of split identity of Westernness and Japaneseness, and it's sort of looking for a self, but really trying to link back with the natural motifs, with what is so strong in Japanese literature in any case, which is this connection with nature, and how that's kind of cut up by so many new inventions, and the desire to be modern is sort of the push and pull, the kind of desire to be modern, and at the same time this sense of loss, which I think you described in many of the writers you translate, this sense of loss of what has gone before, which is so beautifully expressed by someone like Taiji. Motojiro, and it's like we are so we are so we are so drawn to that, I think, as a voice. We find that that ambiguity, that sense of vulnerability and ambiguity is very appealing, I think, to the reader, isn't it? But at the same time, maybe there's a sense also of needing to open up that space, even more now, and so we sort of gone beyond, Japanese writers have gone beyond that sense of like being sort of ambiguous about their personal narratives, and it's maybe a stronger sense of sort of, okay, that loss is part of everywhere, has that sense of loss. So Japanese writers who are reflected in this, current contemporary ones like Haruko Matsuda or Yukiko Motoya, they're playing with everything is open and to be used, and there's no definite sense that one needs to have that whole self, in a sense, that wholeness.
Well, if you think that the most what's considered the most Japanese literary genre in the modern period is the shishosetsu, the I novel. So clearly the watashi, she, watashi, I. I think Japanese writers and intellectuals were absolutely fascinated by the idea of the I, the self, and I think it relates to the language itself, because we start seeing the emergence of personal pronouns in Japanese, in modern Japanese writing, in a way that we didn't see in earlier styles. So there's a real concern with self. But then, if I can I'm just making big jumps here, but there's another way that writers have begun to examine the relationship between self and other and so on. And that is, if you think of someone he's dead now, but someone like Nakagami Kenji. Nakagami Kenji was Burakumin writer, and he saw a kind of politics in a political position in challenging the idea of the modern self, and shall we say the self of the modern Japanese literature, the way it was written in a very almost like sort of based on Western structures of grammar. And instead, Nakagami Kenji went back to, shall we say, oral, circularity, beautiful lyrical stories. But again, bring in gender, rather than it be the language of the masculine self, which is often modern Japanese literature, is often we read it, we have read it traditionally, if you like, as mostly men's voices. Nakagami Kenji, obviously he's a man, but he is reverting to the stories that were told to him by his mother, his grandmother, and so on. And these are stories that keep coming back. And in that sense, that this again disrupts the idea of history, because it becomes circular or repetitive. It comes back again. Actually, rather, when Hachikai-san was saying her fantastic poem about the war, it's the idea of, memory is not, you don't do it once, it keeps coming back, and it keeps needing to be given attention, needs our loving attention. You have to, accept it somehow and articulate it somehow.
Yes, I think that I think that's a really good moment to maybe draw everyone together again. Because there's this idea, I think that's come out of like needing to repeat. Yes, I think Edward Said once said you have to keep telling the same story. You have to keep until people listen. You have to keep telling the same story, in a sense, or keep telling the same story differently, in different ways, in more and more diverse ways. And I think that that comes out very much from what Hachikai was saying about the strength of the personal story, the poetic story. In one poem you can encapsulate a whole era, and using those concrete metaphors. And the same, I think, that Rayna was talking about with some of the more, the way that I think it's called Whispers of the Heart in English, is it? Isaw Takahata's when he talk, he's taking he's dealing with memory in that film very, very much about childhood, and I think that's, for me, that's one of the strongest elements of Japanese culture that we can really learn from, is this unapologetic celebration of childhood, and the way that the way that in literature is always uses childhood memory as somewhere to find one's strength. The stories of the grandmothers and the previous generations, through that very kind of personal interaction, right? That personal intergenerational interaction, and to me that comes, I think that's everywhere in the issue, in as much as that the contemporary scene is so full of many layers of memory. So there's 3/11, and there's the memories of the war. And I think even Hayao Miyazaki, when he went to the places in Tohoku where he saw the disaster had struck, he said, this reminds me, because he was born during the war, reminds me of what Tokyo looked like after the war. So we're living in this moment where there are so many layers of memory and remembering. But I think we can draw hope from what Hachikai Mimi was saying about the power of an individual memory to change the language, to change the way that we remember, perhaps. Are there any more thoughts on that? Maybe Yoshida, Kyoko-san, maybe you have some thoughts, because obviously I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about your work because you translate obviously so much, but you also write in English, and I think I think you write your fiction is also about memory. Is that right? We can't hear you right now.
Yes, sorry. Yeah. So yeah, I was thinking, right now I'm listening and reading Emily Wilson's translation of Odyssey, Odysseus, and that Rayna's and Professor Dodd talks kind of come together inside me, because it's a story of this man trying to go home, and this longing for furusato, but at the same time it's rendered in such a strong captivating manner by this female translator in such a fresh way. So that's what I was thinking about, and this crossing of language, and also that Professor Dodd was mentioning this Greek tradition of pastoral literature, and how different variations in Kindai Bungaku in Japan, and that he was talking about this going back to Furusato and finding it so beautiful, etc. But at the same time, that there's this repulsion, right? That the author left Furusato because he hated it, or he had to abandon it to make it in Tokyo. Then so it's kind of pastoral, the mode as well. And as he lives this life in Tokyo, you kind of create this imaginary furusato. And as long as you see it from the top of the mountain, where you are surrounded by nature, it's a beautiful place you dreamt of, But once you encounter your childhood friends, relatives, that you remember why you had to abandon this place to become who you are today. So there's this as long as it's imaginary, I think it's as a kind of universal aspect of nostalgia. And right now with COVID, that the people are moving, I hear in Europe and UK as well, that the people are moving away from the cities because they don't have to commute, and they find this ideal living environment, in countryside. But also in Japan, I also hear like how countrysides are becoming more provincial, because cities are the evil centers where they spread disease, and they want to shut citizens off their living space. So I'm not sure if this helps, but
yeah. No. We're all thinking about that. Of course, we are. But I think also that I think the question of where we seek our ideal landscapes as well. Obviously, so much has to do with this. We create this exotic this exotic idea, and I think in the issue, one of the things that Miyako Kawakami, who's one of the novelists we interview there, she talks about this, how Japanese culture is often seen through this very sort of exotic, and Stephen Dodd also talks about it, the idea of traditions, and and also maybe some exciting anime and high tech, some of that as well, but like mainly this kind of exoticized ideal of this homeland, where everyone is the same, and, there's no trouble, and, I think that's and she calls it Orientalism 0.2. It's like that's not the reality of Japan, but at the same time it is very much the Japan that the West has created, and or we think of ourselves having. It's not necessarily we created it, but I think I think one of the questions is that then comes up is like how do we translate what comes over in translation, and this do we in a sense when we encounter a new author, yes, when we encounter a new person, we're starting to create a new memory. Yes, we're creating new memories through the act of translation. And so, so that's why I think that, the work that everybody is doing on this is so vital. I mean, just to think about it, manga in the 1950s, for instance, it's not very well known, but in Japan, manga was seen as a kind of cult. It was not pure literature at all. Yeah, so it's not junbungaku. It's like it's completely popular, wouldn't you say, Rayna? So it's like not something you could study at a university. No, yeah, certainly not. And yet now, we now have university professors. We have courses in studying manga. We have people traveling across the world to study how to create manga and anime with Japanese artists. And I think that's what's exciting to hear, is that however much memory is kind of seen as repressed, there's always this movement upwards, often from the grassroots, to say, but maybe if we remember in this way. And I think, to my mind, that the popular distribution of manga is one of the most astonishing cultural facts of Japan right now. Yeah, is that right? Yeah. So
I think one of the most interesting things that you just mentioned was that idea of the popularization of memory.
Yeah,
it happens through literature, film, manga, anime. That idea that a person's memories, a personal account of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example, could become a shared tradition of memory through the popularization, through literature, through manga, or through film. These are hugely important to national and cultural memory.
Yeah. So
just related to that idea of communality, it was a couple of points actually connected to Hachikai-san's poem. One is there was the question of humor in poetry, humor in your poem, and it struck me that humor is always a social act. I mean, in our own heads, we can think of a joke, but it's not funny until you've said it to someone, and until you've shared humor. And humor has obviously, it can be, the role of humor can be very powerful in the most terrible situations. I mean, I can imagine people in the most awful historical moments looking at each other and thinking, wow, this is not good, or something, and laughing. As the tidal wave comes in, or what, something terrible. But it's the fact that we share this together, that the other person can see the ridiculousness of it, and in the laugh, they kind of say, yeah, we're not in control of this world. So it can be a very powerful thing, even though humor often we think of as being very slight. But I actually had a question for Hachikai-san. When it comes to it, particularly in the Japanese context of remembering the war. Of course, in the case of, let's start with, say, the British way of remembering the war. In Britain, war memory, or World War II memory, has become a kind of industry. It's the last thing that Britain won, right? And we're holding on to it forever, right? Or that's the belief.
That was 1966. That was the World Cup.
I've got it. Yes, the other one is the World Cup. Yeah, that's exactly. But when it comes to Japan, or it could be Germany, when it comes to the nations that that lost the war, how is that memory dealt with? That's much more difficult, isn't it? I mean, because people still have memories. They still remember good things, bad things, horrific things, things of pride, things of shame. I mean. That's my question. どうですか？わかりました。つまり戦争の思い出って自分が負けた場合は、あれはもっと難しいじゃないですか。その思い出の 過程というか。間違いかな。
日本での戦争の記憶は、大きく、大雑把に言えば、大まかに言えばですね、加害と被害、加害と被害の両方を記憶していくべきだっていうのが、歴史的な、現在の時点での歴史に関する認識かなと思います。加害と被害、両方ですよね。だから、それを分けることは難しい。両方を日本は背負っていかなければいけません。
At this point, that the general understanding in Japan about war memory is that it has both sides of aggressor and the memory as a victim, and those two are inseparable, and that both have to go together.
And that's actually a very rich, precious way of remembering, don't you think? I mean, in a sense, like if the British way is always like, oh yes, we Brits, we're on the winning side, it means you can never move on. I mean, I remember reading about German history, and the saving grace of Germany now is they cannot depend on their history. They cannot say, oh, well, things were better in the past, because there were things that were not so good. So all they can do is try and make the world better.
Yes.
And the danger, I'm not saying that all Brits are like, but the danger of those who see themselves as the victors is they never want to let go. They can't let go of that memory.
戦国側は勝った思い出っていうのにしがみついていて、そこからなかなか前に進もうとしないんだけれども、例えばドイツとかだとその過去を振り返ってそこからより良い方向に持っていくしかない。そういう意味では加害と被害っていうそういう何ですか、深みのある多面性のある記憶があるっていうことは実は幸運なことじゃないのかっていう指摘ですね。
勝った思い出にしがみついてた日本は日露戦争の後ですよ。
It's a Russo-Japan War when Japan was clinging to this memory as a victor.
それで間違ったんですよ、日本は。
So that's and the World War II is a consequence of that.
ありがとう. Yeah, it's really good. So I think I'm going to bring in some of the questions I think that were asked. I think that Heidi has been kindly collecting them. I think it's a good place to pause.
You discussed as a panel a lot about the Furusato idea, and one questioner is asking whether in the present day, when there's so much movement and people don't have the same kind of rural Furusato that the nostalgia has created, that we all people look back to, what kind of future does the Furusato motif have in that background with depopulation and changing in identity of place?
Yeah, that's a big question with with huge changes in the countryside. Perhaps we could go to maybe Kyoko. So maybe you'd like to look at that.
I grew up in the suburb myself, and I moved to Kyoto as a college student. And from there, I studied in the United States, and I grew up in Kyushu. And then after I got my degree, I worked in Tokyo, Yokohama area, and now I'm back in Kyoto. And in this process, I feel like, that the Furusato is, I feel like I'm kind of floating all the time. But at the same time, that I'm glad I'm based in Kyoto, and I have a feeling like for many Japanese cities like Kyoto provides a kind of how do you say, a fictional Furusato or imaginary Furusato. It's a real place, but at the same time that they can say Japan used to be like this, which is not true, but or this is where you feel like you kind of connect with your roots and past.
Yes.
think we're seeing that in anime an awful lot at the moment.
Totally. And I think anime is a trope where you see this idea of furusato in picture.
And not just in pictures, you now get phone apps where you can go to the same real world staircase that the characters from Your Name stood on in the movie. You know, so there
it's
are
a
also
pilgrimage.
Yeah.
It's a seichi junrei that the anime fan visit the sites of anime. So it's kind of double exposure. It's a real place, but at the same time you can kind of augment the reality with the anime image. That's a great point.
I think we have to be aware that it can also be extremely dangerous. I mean, we're talking politics. I've just written down Orban in Hungary, Poland, Japan, UK, USA. We've all got very aggressive right-wing governments that play on the idea of identity. And, we are, whoever we are, we are the people. And we're not Jewish, we're not Muslims, we're not gay people, we're not uppity women. I mean, there's many ways in which you can identify, and it's a kind of scary moment. On the other hand, there's nothing wrong with furusato identity. So I'm just, from my own experience, like being in the UK. I mean, I was supposed to be in Japan for a year, but didn't go because of the virus. And the virus has also brought out, I think, a very lovely feeling of community and helping each other. And I'm sure it's happened in other countries as well. Also, all I'm saying is that this content of the furusato is entirely neutral.
Yes.
It's an empty vessel, and we can put what we like into it. Obviously, then we have to decide which side we're on. I mean, shouldn't say that.
But
I'm curious to hear what Hachikai-san has to say. コロナウイルス後での共同体の感覚みたいなのが変わりました、日本で。
今、日本はちょうどお盆なんですよね。13、14、15日。テレビのニュースで言っていることは、若者が地方の実家に帰りたい、家に帰りたいけど、コロナを移すかもしれないから帰ってくるなと言われているってニュースでよく言っています。
Yeah, so you're not,
On period right now in Japan, that's when all the spirits, it's supposed to come back, ancestor spirits supposed to come back to furusato precisely, and many young people who work in the cities travel back to their hometowns, but right now old parents are telling them not to come because they don't want to catch the COVID.
And linked to Obon and also to the recent commemorations or memorials for the 75th anniversary of the atomic bomb, somebody's asking how the act of remembrance has evolved over the decades in Japan. How has that changed? You've touched on it a bit in your discussions, but could you elaborate on that a bit more? Maybe.
Yes. So
time for Hachikai-san to get the question translated, but maybe start with Yoshida-san or Stephen.
I think it would be, yes, I think it's important to think that there's, memory is very politically sensitive, as Stephen has said. So, and remembrance. So at the moment, I think in Japan, for instance, there haven't been very big ceremonies for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because most people have been obviously shielding. It's a very old generation, 70s and 80s, so there have been small but significant ceremonies to remember the bombings, with not many foreigners present. But I think it would be interesting to talk about the way that memory interacts with. It's an international subject. Memory of war is an international question. So it's not just, about people in Japan. It's around the world, how we remember each other's dead and in the war. So but perhaps Hachikai-san would like to speak a little bit from the Japanese perspective.
戦争を体験した人が高齢化しているので、実際の話を聞くことが難しくなってきているという課題があります。で若い人たちの中には、8月15日が戦争が終わった日というふうに知らない人たちも出てきていることは問題だと思います。でも、日本社会ではやはり戦後75年ということを、様々なメディアではもちろん、大切に大きく取り上げていて、この悲惨な記憶を、戦争という悲惨な記憶を受け継いでいこうという意思は感じられます。
So those who have experienced the war firsthand, they are now becoming very old, and it's becoming more and more difficult to hear their stories directly. And meanwhile, there are younger people who don't know that the August 15th was the end of war. And this is becoming a problem. But at the same time, media are featured about the 75th anniversary of bombing and the end of the war, and she could feel that they feel it's their responsibility to pass along these memories to the next generation.
もう一つは、例えば広島の原爆資料館についてですが、中学生や高校生の修学旅行、これがコロナの影響で取りやめになっていることが多いので、それによって、今年は体験できない若者が出ているということもニュースなどで報じられていました。
Another thing is about the school trips to the Hiroshima or Nagasaki memorial museums. It's lots of schools in western part of Japan take trips to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, visit the museums, but this year many school trips are cancelled because of the coronavirus, and that might affect future somehow.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we have to find new ways to remember, maybe digital ways at the moment in any sense. But I think, are there any more questions, or shall we draw to...
there are a lot of questions. We don't have time to go to them all, but maybe looking forward, we've been remembering quite a lot, but there's a question from Matthew Perkins for writers and poets and manga writers, as well as asking where do I come from and the Furusato idea, should we ask the question, what can we do to affect political change or to shape the public discourse? And are those questions related?
So say again, so the question about
maybe Rayna would like
manga, and then yes.
Are
you clear on the question? Yes.
Well, is my sound any better now?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, great. Absolutely, I think those questions are increasingly being linked. Who are we and what can we do to improve the world that we live in? Absolutely are becoming linked. I think this generation coming through now perhaps are more aware of those issues than ever before. But even people like Miyazaki for decades now have been trying to push for a better relationship between humanity and the environment. And I think what we see particularly in Japanese authors and the work of mangaka and others, is a push to understanding through activism in many cases. So yes, there's lots of frivolous manga out there, but there are also manga that are about education. There's manga that are about subjects for learning for schools. And I think there's also ways in which those kinds of media, from manga through to anime and film and literature, have all been used to create memory and also to think forward. So Hibakusha cinema is a really good example of this, where atomic bomb survivors were trying to get their stories out in the post-war period and started to use manga and anime and film to do so, because actually there was a desire to forget. And so the media become, these media that we share, that become our collective memories, also become a way of remembering the past so that we don't forget and we can move forward in positive ways in the future, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest selling mangas worldwide is this Hadashi no Den, is Barefoot Gen, which has been translated to almost into scores and scores of languages. And it's an incredibly, it's a personal memoir, fictionalized obviously, but it's actually contains incredible research that was done by survivors themselves after the bomb, and that kind of manga can be really used to help become aware of the kinds of issues around nuclear warfare and so on, that young people could really pick up on now. Nakazawa unfortunately died a few years back, but he really, he drove that that book to 10 volumes, so that's can be a good place to begin to understand a bit. There are different views obviously, but it's very powerful drawing. And it's a very emotional story. So,
yeah, talking about that, what can we do, or like who are we, or who are these people, instead of where I come from, that Rayna mentioned like a BL tradition that started, the very strong in Japan, but now I think I have a feeling like BL in the beginning, it used to be more like a fantasy realm of the heteronormative women who live in this very patriarchal society. They are trying to imagine another place for romance. But now I think it's kind of coming to reality. And the one example I can think of in manga is that Kino Nani Tabeta? Is that the title? Right?
That's right.
Yeah. Who's the author?
Oh, now you're testing me. I'm not going to remember. I've been looking at this for the last week or so because it's
Fumi.
so
yeah. And it's a story of this middle-aged gay couple and everyday life, what they eat for dinner, that's what it is, and you get the recipe. But the great part is that it's in this journal for men. So it's a wonderful story that but it's also a form of activism, right? Yeah.
And I think that's something we didn't talk about with Stephen that we should have asked, which is about furusato and the connection to food.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, there's a whole thing about it. I mean, if I can just sort of add perhaps a hopeful note, and this question of like the new generation, what's the new generation going to do? How are they going to change the world? And I'm of a generation that is full of people who complain that young people today, are not active, they're activists and all that sort of stuff. Now, I think we can see now that's not true, various things happening in the world. But also I think that we just have to have faith that every generation that comes along, if something happens or if there is a problem that needs to be articulated, people will find a way. I mean, the biggest thing, of course, is climate change. And, you can bet that my guarantee is the next 30 years, there'll be a lot of argument and a lot of talk and a lot of literature and poetry and and music or whatever about climate change. And that's because it's one of those things that you can't, you unless you just go to sleep, you can't fail to notice it. So I mean, it doesn't have to be climate change, but all I'm saying is that the next wave of activism will find its own expression quite naturally. I think politics is never dies.
No, and we've just been told that the author of that manga that you mentioned, Kino Nani Tabeta, is Fumi Yoshinaka.
Oh,
Apparently. Sorry, sorry I didn't mean to cut you there, Stephen. But I just bringing that in. And is there anything that Hachikai-san wanted to say, perhaps on this, and then we might have to bring this great discussion to a fortunate end.
原爆に関する漫画とアニメだったら、近年日本で非常に話題になった作品は、河野文雄さんのこの世界の片隅でという作品です。これは原爆を描いてますが、過去の作品のようにイデオロギー中心で語るのではなくて、個人の生活が失われる、戦争によって個人の生活のささやかな幸せが奪われるというところに焦点を当てている作品ですね。そのことがおそらく現代の読者あるいは視聴者に対してとても深く届いているということかなと思います。
That one manga work that got lots of attention on Hiroshima bombing, and which was also made into anime, is Fumio Kono. この世界の片隅で. What's the
in this corner of the world? Yes?
In this corner of the world, yeah. I always like it, but anyway, and that instead of telling the story through the anti-war ideology, this manga depicts the everyday life of the main characters, and by depicting how these little details of everyday life was suddenly taken away by the bombing. That this was kind of new way of representing the Hiroshima bombing, and that Hachikai-san thinks that is why it appealed to younger generation of the readers and audience.
Yes. So luckily we have a whole article. Unfortunately, it's in English at the moment. It's all about that very manga by Kono Fumio, and also another manga writer, Kyo Machiko. So please do, that brings me perfectly to close, please do buy a copy of Wasafiri 102. You will find many, many interesting younger writers and artists, as well as the great speakers we've had on this panel discussion. And thank you so much for taking the time out to listen to us today. Any other questions, I think that they can be sent to us by the Japan Society. And maybe we can continue the discussion elsewhere in other rooms, literal or virtual. And so we'll meet again soon. Yes. Thank you so much for joining us.